She was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, and calloused to the bone, and the town had already decided she was finished. Not broken, not grieving, not struggling. Finished, like a field gone to seed, like a candle burned past its wick. She had buried her mother with her own hands and returned home to find her brother waiting at the kitchen table with a stranger and a debt she had not made. Something was about to change. Not because the world grew kinder, but because Abigail Rose Fenwick finally stopped waiting for permission to survive. Stay with her. You will want to see where this road ends. The morning they came to collect her, the sky was the color of old pewter, low, and pressing, the kind of sky that did not promise rain so much as it promised consequence. Abigail had been up since before dawn. That was not unusual. She had been rising before the sun for so many years that she sometimes forgot there were people in the world who slept until it was fully light, who woke to warmth already laid in the hearth by someone else's hands. She had no such luxury, had never had it, and somewhere along the way she had stopped thinking of that fact as a hardship and begun thinking of it simply as the shape of her life. You work, you endure. You do not complain because complaining costs energy that is better spent on the next task. The farmhouse was small and tired, the kind of structure that had been patched so many times it was difficult to say which parts were original and which were desperation made solid. She had repaired the south wall herself 3 winters ago when the timber rotted through. She had re-chinked the gaps around the window frames with a mixture of clay and dried grass. The way her mother had shown her when she was 7 years old, crouched beside the older woman in the cold mud, learning the world, not through school books, but through necessity. Her mother's hands had been just like hers, wide and capable, mapped with old scars and newer cuts, the hands of a woman who had made something from very little for a very long time. Her mother had been dead now for 11 days. Abigail had not yet permitted herself to sit still long enough to fully feel what that meant. There were things to do. There were always things to do, and grief, she had found, was something you could carry in motion better than you could carry it at rest. When you stopped moving, the weight of it pressed down all at once, and she was not sure she was ready for that kind of reckoning. So she moved. She swept. She salted the remaining pork from the last slaughter. She hauled water from the well, even though her arms ached, and her lower back had developed a deep, persistent ache that she chose to ignore. She was hauling the second bucket back from the well when she heard the sound of a horse she did not recognize. The animal was not from their stable. She knew the gait of every horse within a mile by sound alone. Another of her mother's lessons, practical and quiet, and worth more than it seemed. This one moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a well-fed animal ridden by a confident man, a man who was in no hurry because he had already decided the outcome of whatever brought him here. She set the bucket down and straightened her back. 2 men came around the bend in the wagon road. The first was a stranger, thick through the chest and neck, wearing a decent coat that had been expensive once and had since descended into a kind of respectable shabbiness. His eyes moved across the property with the appraising slowness of a man calculating value, not admiring beauty. The second man was her brother. Harlan Fenwick was 35 years old and had spent the better part of his adult life perfecting the art of appearing to work without actually working. He had their father's jaw, and their father's restlessness, and none of their mother's steadiness. He had been at various points in his life a farmhand, a traveling salesman, a poker player of middling skill and extraordinary confidence, and most recently, a man with debts that had grown too large to ignore. Abigail had known about the debts the way you know about weather coming. You can feel it in your joints before the clouds arrive. He did not meet her eyes when he rode up. That told her everything. "Abigail," he said in the particular tone he used when he was about to ask her to accept something unreasonable as if it were a minor inconvenience. "Harlan," she said. The thick-chested man dismounted with the ease of someone accustomed to other people's discomfort and extended his hand. "Miss Fenwick, name's Calder Voss. I have some business to discuss with you." She did not take his hand. She looked at her brother. "What did you do?" It was not a question. The shape of her voice was flat and certain, the voice of a woman who had stopped being surprised by this particular kind of disappointment long ago, but who still felt the landing of it every time like a stone dropped into still water. Harlan finally looked at her. In his eyes was the specific expression of a man who had rehearsed his justifications so many times that he had almost convinced himself of them. "Mama is gone. The farm alone isn't enough to cover what I owe. I've been trying to figure a way out, Abby, I have, but there isn't one. Voss has made a fair arrangement." "A fair arrangement," she repeated. "You would work his property," Voss said. His voice was pleasant in the way that some cold things are pleasant when you do not yet understand that the cold will hurt you. Room and board provided. Useful work for a capable woman. The debt would be settled. She stood very still. She understood in the clarity of that moment what was actually being offered. Not employment, not a wage, a transfer. The same way you transferred livestock, the same way you settled an account by handing over a piece of property you no longer wished to keep. She was not being hired. She was being sold, and the currency was her brother's weakness, and the price was her entire life. She looked at Calder Voss with the kind of attention that he was not expecting from a woman standing in a muddy farmyard holding a water bucket. She looked at the way he held his reins loose but always ready. She looked at the scar along his left jawline, old and badly healed, the kind left by a man who fights and does not stop when the other person asks him to. She looked at his hands. She had grown up learning to read men the way other children learned their letters. Her mother had taught her this, too quietly, without ever naming the lesson. Watch the hands. Watch the eyes when they think you are not looking. Watch what a man does when he believes he has already won. Voss believed he had already won. "No," she said. Harlan made a sound of anguished frustration. "Abigail, you don't understand the position I'm in." "I understand it perfectly," she said. "I understand that you made the position yourself, and that you have now decided I am the solution to it. I won't be." "The law is on Mr. Voss's side," Harlan said, and the shame in his voice had curdled into something harder. The defensiveness of a man who knows he is wrong but has run out of better options. "The debt's been formalized. There are papers." "Then show me the papers," she said, "and I will tell you what I think of them." She did not actually believe papers would help her. She had no formal education in legal matters, no money for a lawyer, no family beyond the man currently selling her. She was making time. She was watching Voss. She was thinking. What she was thinking was this, the storm coming from the northwest, the one she had been tracking for 2 days by the pressure in her ears and the behavior of the cattle in the neighboring field and the particular quality of the light at dusk. That storm was going to hit within 48 hours. It was going to be massive. She knew it the way she knew other things that could not be easily explained through a lifetime of paying attention to the world around her while everyone else paid attention to other things. She also knew that she could not be what Calder Voss intended her to be. She had seen the healed scar on his jaw. She had seen the way his eyes moved over the property, and then over her, as though accounting for inventory. She had known men like him in the abstract, had heard enough from enough women to understand what lay at the end of that road. She would not walk it. The papers were produced. They were real enough. Her brother had signed them, had indeed signed something that in the eyes of whatever corrupt arrangement he had made with Voss constituted a binding agreement. She read them slowly, her lips not moving, though she was aware that both men expected them to. She had taught herself to read from her mother's Bible, and from a handful of almanacs, and from the labels on medicine bottles and seed packets, and she was better at it than anyone who had seen her in a farmyard would have guessed. "I'll need a night to put the house in order," she said, her voice entirely level. "It wouldn't be decent to leave without securing things properly. You can return in the morning." Voss studied her for a long moment. He was looking for the trick in it. She could see him looking, and he could not find it, because she gave him nothing to find. Her face was composed. Her hands were still. "Dawn," he said finally. "We leave at dawn." "Dawn," she agreed. They rode away. Harlan paused at the bend and looked back at her once with an expression she refused to categorize or interpret, because doing so would cost her something she needed to keep. She turned away before he could speak and went back inside. She moved quickly then. She did not pack in the way a woman packing for a normal journey might pack, selecting things with sentiment or comfort in mind. She packed for survival and nothing else. Her mother's hunting knife, a short-bladed tool, worn smooth at the handle, sharp enough to skin a rabbit or gut a fish or cut rope. A coil of thin, strong twine. Flint and steel wrapped in oiled cloth, her heaviest wool stockings, the thickest undershirt she owned, the outer coat that had belonged to her father and was far too large for her in the conventional sense. But was she new warm enough to make the difference between life and death in open country? She rolled a blanket tightly and tied it to her back with a length of rope. She hesitated over the small tin on the kitchen shelf, the one her mother had kept her remedies in dried yarrow and willow bark and a little packet of salt. She took it. She did not take anything that belonged to Harlan. She did not take anything that could be called theft. She took only what had been hers or their mother's, and she left everything else exactly as it was. At the kitchen table she sat for exactly 5 minutes. She allowed herself that. She put her hands flat on the surface on the scarred old wood she had scrubbed hundreds of times, and she breathed. She thought of her mother, not the end of her, not the long illness and the difficult final weeks, but the earlier version, the strong and steady woman with the capable hands and the calm voice who had looked at the world's unkindness and decided quietly and without fanfare to outlast it. "I am going to outlast it too," Abigail said aloud to the empty room, to the fading warmth of the last fire. She rose, adjusted the coat on her shoulders, and walked out the back door into the cold. She did not look back. The first hour was manageable. She knew the land immediately surrounding the farmhouse well enough to move through it in the dark, keeping low and moving fast, angling northwest toward the higher country, because that was away from the valley, and away from the town, and away from everything she needed to be away from. The cold was present but not yet dangerous, a firm and persistent thing rather than an assault. By the second hour it had grown teeth. The wind picked up from the direction she had expected northwest, rolling down from the peaks with the kind of force that was not theatrical but simply relentless. She pulled her collar higher and kept moving. She knew, because her mother had taught her, that cold is most dangerous when it deceives you into stopping. The body wants to find shelter and curl into itself and wait for rescue. That impulse had killed people. She kept her feet moving even when her toes began to lose their feeling, flexing them deliberately inside her boots, with each step maintaining circulation through sheer willful repetition. She crossed a frozen creek bed, testing each step, distributing her weight carefully, moving in the unhurried way that counterintuitively required more discipline than speed. The ice held. She moved on. The terrain began to rise. Pine trees thickened around her, which was both shelter and navigation. She moved between them like a current, finding its channel, reading the slope of the ground and the way the wind moved differently through open spaces than through dense growth. She was tracking uphill and northwest into the Black Ridge country, the high mountain territory that the people in the valley spoke of only in cautionary terms, a place of bad weather and badder men and no law at all. She was aware with a calm precision that might have surprised anyone who could have seen her face in that darkness that she might not survive this. The storm was coming faster than she had expected, or she had been slower than she needed to be, and the combination of those two facts was producing a narrowing window that she was watching with the detached attention of someone calculating odds. She was also aware that going back was not an option. The choice was not between safety and danger. It had not been that kind of choice since the moment Calder Voss dismounted in her yard and looked at her property the way men look at things they intend to own. The choice was between this danger and that one, and this danger, at least, left her own. 4 hours from the farm, with the wind now driving needles of ice horizontally through the air, and her breath crystallizing before it left her face. Abigail rose. Fenwick. Topped a ridge she had not known was there, and stopped. Below, half buried in the lee of the slope, and almost entirely invisible against the snow-heavy pines, was a cabin. Small, solid, the kind of structure built by someone who understood that a building's first obligation was to endure. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney, almost immediately torn apart by the wind. Someone was inside. She stood on the ridge and waited. The storm behind her was no longer a distant threat. It was arriving. She could feel it in the air pressure, in the way sound had changed around her, the particular silence that precedes a true whiteout, when the world narrows to what is immediately in front of you and then narrows further still. She had perhaps 30 minutes of manageable conditions left, and that estimate was generous. She thought about what a person inside that cabin might be. She thought about Calder Voss's hands. She thought about the stories people in the valley told about the mountain men up here. Whispered stories, dark ones, the kind told to keep children close and women afraid. She thought about her mother's voice. Read the situation. Every situation has a logic. Find the logic. The logic was this: the storm outside would kill her with the impersonal certainty of mathematics. Whatever was inside that cabin was at least a variable. A variable could be managed. Mathematics could not be argued with. Abigail rose. Fenwick squared her broad shoulders, checked that her mother's knife was accessible at her belt, and walked down the ridge toward the light. The door was not locked. That was the first thing she noticed, and it told her something. A man living alone in the high country, far from any town and far from any law, who did not lock his door at night, was either very confident or very indifferent to what the world might send him. She pushed it open with the flat of her hand and stepped inside out of the driving wind, and the warmth of the interior hit her like a physical thing. Not comfortable warmth, but the profound, almost painful warmth of a body that has been cold for too long, suddenly meeting heat. She had perhaps 3 seconds before she heard the hammer cock. Step away from the door. The voice came from the far corner of the single room, low and without inflection, the voice of a man who was not alarmed, but was also not interested in being tested. She could not see him clearly. The fire in the hearth was the only light, and it threw the far corner into deep shadow, but she could see the outline of him now, large seated, and the longer shape across his lap, that was the rifle. She stepped away from the door. She did not raise her hands. Raising your hands was a performance of submission, and she had learned in a long life of managing difficult men that performance invited a particular kind of contempt. Instead, she stood where she was dripping meltwater onto the floorboards and let him see her. "Close it," he said. She reached back and pulled the door shut. The wind that had been screaming through it dropped to a moan and then to nothing. The man rose from the corner, and in the firelight she got her first real look at him. He was not what the valley stories had led her to expect. Or rather, he was exactly what they had described, and the description had still failed to prepare her for the actuality of him. He was very tall and built without any waist to it, the kind of build that comes not from vanity, but from years of physical work in country that does not forgive softness. His face was scarred along the left side, a long seam of healed tissue running from his cheekbone to his jaw, and his eyes, even in the low light, were a shade of pale gray that registered everything and expressed almost nothing. His hair was dark over long, and his beard was the beard of a man who did not own a mirror or did not care to use one. He leveled the rifle at her chest with a steadiness that told her his hands were not trembling, and his breathing was not elevated. He was not frightened of her. He was not angry. He was simply assessing the way you assess a problem before deciding how to handle it. "You have about 30 seconds, he said, to tell me who you are and what you are doing in my cabin." "Abigail Fenwick," she said, "and your cabin was closer than dying in the snow." Something moved behind his eyes, not warmth, more like the registration of an unexpected variable. "Where did you come from?" "A farm about 4 hours south and down. I am not being followed, if that is your concern. Nobody knows I came this direction." She paused. "At least not yet." "At least not yet," he repeated, and the flatness of his voice gave her no indication of how he was receiving this. "There is a storm coming," she said, "a serious one. I have been watching it for 2 days. If I had stayed on the lower ground, I would have frozen to death before morning, and if I had tried to turn back toward the valley, the same would have been true. Your cabin was the only option that gave me a reasonable chance of surviving the night." She said it simply, without pleading in it, because it was simply the truth. "I am not asking for your charity. I am asking for 4 walls and a fire until the storm passes." He studied her for a long time. She did not look away. She had been looked at in many ways in her life. She had been looked at with contempt, the particular contempt reserved for a woman who does not conform to the expected shape of a woman, too large, too direct, too undecorated by the softening habits that made other people comfortable. She had been looked at with dismissal, which was almost the same thing, but faster. She had been looked at with the specific calculating interest of men like Calder Voss, which was perhaps the worst kind, because it reduced you to arithmetic. This man looked at her the way she looked at terrain she was trying to understand. He was reading her for information, not for weakness. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was a different one. "Turn around," he said. She turned. She understood she was being checked for weapons or for the silhouette of someone who was not traveling alone. She had the knife at her belt and nothing else, and when she turned back to face him, she made no move to conceal it. "The knife stays at your belt," he said. "You reach for it, I will not ask why." "Understood." He lowered the rifle. He did not put it down. He rested it against the wall within easy reach, which was a distinction she noted and respected. "There is a corner," he said, tilting his head toward the near side of the hearth. "You sleep there. You do not touch anything that is not yours. You do not go through my supplies. You do not leave until I say the storm has passed, because you will not be able to judge it from inside, and I will." "That is acceptable," she said. "It is not an offer," he said. "It is the terms." "I understood that," she said. She crossed to the corner he had indicated and set her roll down. She sat on it, pulled her outer coat tighter around her, and held her hands toward the fire. The feeling coming back into her fingers was excruciating. The kind of deep, radiating pain that she had experienced before, and knew meant she had come closer to the edge than she had permitted herself to acknowledge while she was still outside. She kept her face still through it. The man sat back down in his corner. He picked up something from the floor beside him, a length of leather. He appeared to be repairing a harness strap or a boot, and he worked at it without looking at her again. The fire crackled. The storm outside had arrived in full force now, and she could hear it pressing against the cabin walls with a sound like a living thing, a low and continuous roar that was neither dramatic nor comforting, but simply present. The cabin held. It was well built. She noticed the kind of construction that had been done with patience and with the intention of permanence. The chinking between the logs was tight. The roof did not creak in a way that suggested weakness. Whoever had built this place or repaired it into its current solidity had understood what they were doing. "You built this," she said. It was not quite a question. He did not look up from the leather. "Does it matter?" "No," she said. "I was observing, not making conversation." A pause. He continued working. "The chinking on the north wall is newer than the rest," she added, because it was true, and because she was the kind of person who could not entirely stop noticing things. It was not a habit she could switch off. "You repaired it recently. You used a clay mixture with something fibrous in it. Dried grass or pine needle, probably." He looked up then. The gray eyes found her across the firelit room with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite suspicion, but contained elements of both. "Pine needle," he said after a moment. "It holds better in the freeze-thaw cycle," she said. "My mother showed me." He looked at her for another moment, then returned to the leather. She did not speak again for a long time. She ate nothing because she did not ask and was not offered, and she was not going to ask. She watched the fire and listened to the storm and let the warmth gradually work its way back into her body, layer by layer, the way heat returns to stone that has been cold for a long time slowly and from the outside in. Her eyes grew heavy. She did not intend to sleep. It was not wise to sleep in an unknown place with an unknown man, but her body had been moving for the better part of 8 hours in worsening cold, and it had its own opinion about what happened next. She fell asleep, sitting up her back against the log wall, her hands folded in her lap, her chin dropping to her chest. She did not know how long she slept. When she woke, the fire had been built up considerably more wood than she had left in it. When she closed her eyes, and there was a folded piece of rough canvas near her feet that had not been there before. Not a blanket, nothing so generous as that, but something to lie on so that she was not sleeping directly on the cold planks. She looked across the room. The man, Silas, she did not know his name yet, was asleep in his chair, the rifle across his knees, his chin tilted up, breathing with the deep regularity of a man who had trained himself to sleep in difficult conditions. She considered the canvas for a moment. Then she lay down on it, pulled her coat over herself, and slept again. In the morning he told her his name. He did not offer it as a social gesture. He said it the way you say a thing that is simply factual and therefore necessary to establish. "Silas Mercer," he said, standing at the small stove with a pot of something that smelled of boiled grain and salt. "You are Fenwick." "Abigail," she said. "Fenwick is enough," he said, and poured a portion of the grain into a second bowl and set it on the table without ceremony or eye contact. She sat at the table and ate. So did he. The food was plain and adequate, exactly what you would expect from a man who cooked for function and not for pleasure, but she had eaten worse and was grateful for the warmth of it. The storm outside was still raging, a fact they could both hear without needing to discuss it. "How long?" she said. "Day and a half," he said. "Maybe 2. She nodded and finished her bowl. After breakfast, without being asked and without announcing it, she identified where the firewood was stacked along the outer wall of a lean-to attached to the cabin's east side, put on her coat, and went out into the screaming cold for exactly as long as it took to haul 3 armloads inside and restack them by the hearth. The wind tried to take her off her feet twice. She braced against it and kept moving. When she came back inside the second time, she saw Silas watching her from across the room with the same quality of attention he had turned on her the night before, the terrain-reading attention, and she met his gaze briefly and then went back out for the 3rd load. When she came back inside for the last time, stamping snow from her boots and pulling the door against the force of the wind, he said nothing, but he had refilled the pot on the stove. The hours passed in a way she had not expected. She had prepared herself for hostility, or at minimum for the kind of cold coexistence that was simply two people sharing a space while maintaining maximum internal distance. What she got was something different and harder to name. He did not speak much, but what he said was direct and without performance, and when she responded in kind, something shifted fractionally, like ice settling. "You said nobody knows you came this direction," he said midway through the afternoon. He was cleaning the rifle with the methodical attention of a man for whom the maintenance of tools was a form of meditation. "That won't hold." "Not indefinitely," she agreed. She was working at a tear in the seam of her coat with a needle she had in her kit, one of 4. She always carried another of her mother's teachings. "Someone will come looking eventually." "The someone who is looking," he said, not looking up from the rifle, "do they have authority, legal or otherwise?" She considered how to answer this. "They have papers," she said finally, "and a man with papers generally finds someone willing to treat them as authority." "What kind of papers?" "Debt settlement. My brother owed money. I was the asset used to settle it." The hands on the rifle did not stop moving. He continued working the cleaning cloth through the barrel with the same steady pressure. But she saw his jaw change a subtle tightening along the scarred side of his face there, and then controlled. "Voss," he said. The name came out of nowhere, and it stopped her needle mid-stitch. She looked up. "Calder Voss," he said, "out of the South Valley." "You know him," she said. "I know of him," Silas said, and the distinction in his voice was not a small one. "He has done this before. He acquires debts specifically because of what the debtors have to offer him beyond money." He set the rifle down and finally looked at her directly. "You were right to run." The simplicity of it, the unadorned affirmation that her reading of the situation had been correct, should not have affected her as much as it did. She had not been uncertain about her own judgment. She had made her choice, and she stood by it. But there is a particular aloneness in carrying a correct judgment entirely by yourself and having made the right call with no one to witness it or confirm it, and the small quiet acknowledgment from this hard and reticent man reached something in her that she had not realized was waiting for it. "I know," she said. "He will send people," Silas said. "I know that too." He picked up the rifle again and resumed cleaning it. "Then we will need to think about what happens when the storm breaks." It was the first time he had said "we." She heard it. She did not remark on it. She returned to her stitching with a steadiness that cost her slightly more effort than it should have, and the fire burned on between them, and outside the blizzard threw itself against the walls of the cabin with the mindless persistence of something that did not know it had already failed. That night he told her his name had a reputation. He said it without preamble, the way he said most things standing by the window and looking out at the white dark. "If people come asking in the lower towns and someone points them toward this mountain, the name Mercer will come up. It may complicate things for you." "What will they say about you?" she asked. "That I killed a man in Harrow County," he said. "That I am dangerous and without conscience, and that the only reason I was never hanged for it is because I disappeared into the Black Ridge before anyone could organize a proper pursuit." She set down the harness she had been helping him repair because her hands were better at it than his, a fact neither of them had commented on. "Did you kill a man in Harrow County?" "Yes," he said. The fire crackled. Outside the storm. "Are the rest of the things they say about you true?" she asked. He turned from the window then and looked at her, and in the firelight the scar along his face was very visible, and his gray eyes were very still. "No," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, reading it the way she read terrain for information for the logic of the situation. Then she picked up the harness again. "Then I am not concerned," she said, and went back to work. He stood at the window for another long moment. Then he crossed to his chair, sat down, and picked up his own work, and she heard in the silence that followed the very faint and barely perceptible quality of a man who has been braced for something for a very long time, slowly, carefully beginning to unbrace. The storm broke on the second morning, not gently. It did not fade so much as it simply stopped, the way a fist unclenches all at once, leaving behind a silence so complete it had its own texture. Abigail woke to it before she was fully conscious of waking the sudden absence of the wind, registering in her body as a change in pressure, and she was sitting up and reaching for her coat before she had entirely assembled the fact of where she was. Silas was already at the window. The world outside was white to a degree that required adjustment. The snow had drifted against the cabin's north wall to the height of the eaves, and the tree line beyond was so heavily laden that the pines had changed their shape entirely, become rounded and soft and unfamiliar. The sky above was a blue so cold and clean it looked like something that had been scoured. There was no movement anywhere. The storm had passed and taken all sound with it. "It will hold," he said without turning from the window. "The sky is stable. We have a good day before anything else comes through." She understood what he was not quite saying. A good day to do the things that needed doing before they could no longer afford not to. She laced her boots and stood. They went out together. The work of the first few days after a storm of that magnitude was not subtle. The lean-to roof had partially collapsed under the snow weight, and the stack of firewood beneath it required digging out and restacking. 2 of Silas's traps set in the timber below the ridge needed checking and resetting. The path from the cabin door to the water source, a small spring that kept running even in the worst cold because it came up from deep ground, needed to be broken open and cleared. They divided the work without discussion. She took the traps because she read the terrain around them more quickly than he did, which surprised him. She could see it surprise him, a brief recalibration in his expression when she returned in half the time he had allocated for the task, with 2 rabbits and a reset on the 3rd trap that had been sprung without catching anything. She cleaned them at the outdoor post with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. He watched for a moment, then went back to the roof repair without comment. That was the texture of those early days. Work performed in parallel, skills exchanged without sentimentality, a respect that built not through words, but through the slow accumulation of observed competence. She had expected Silas to give orders. That was the model she knew. Men gave orders, and women either followed them or found ways to root around them that preserved everyone's dignity. But he did not operate that way. He identified what needed doing and did it. And if she was already doing it, he redirected without friction. It was a collaboration she had never experienced with anyone except her mother, and the familiarity of the rhythm caught her off guard in quiet moments. By the 4th day, she had taken over the smoking of the meat. By the 5th, he had stopped watching her do things as though checking for errors and started watching her the way you watch someone whose method has earned your attention. By the 6th day, she had begun to understand that the isolation of this place was not accidental. The evidence was in the details. The cabin had no identifying marks visible from the trail below. The path that approached it branched 3 times in ways that would send an unfamiliar traveler consistently in the wrong direction. The water spring was accessed through a gap in the rock face that you would not notice unless you knew it was there. Silas had not retreated to the wilderness. He had engineered his own disappearance with considerable care, and had maintained it with equal care for what she was beginning to estimate was several years at least. She did not ask about it directly. She had learned that direct questions produced answers that were technically complete and entirely closed the answers of a man who had spent years seeing questions as the prelude to judgment. So instead she asked sideways, "You were here before this winter," she said one evening, watching him sharpen a blade by the fire. "Before last winter, too." "Yes," he said. "You don't resupply from the valley." "I trade," he said, "with a man 3 ridges west. He doesn't ask questions. Because he doesn't know who you are. Because he has the sense not to," Silas said, and the correction was gentle but precise. She filed that away. He was not hiding because he was afraid of being found. He was hiding because he had made a calculation about what the world outside offered him versus what it cost him, and the math had not favored staying in it. She understood that calculation, in a way she had not expected to understand it, had made a version of it herself on the night she walked out her back door and into the dark. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of a small thing. She had gone to the spring alone on the 8th morning earlier than usual because she had slept poorly, and moving was better than lying in the dark cataloging the uncertain future. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the trail to the spring had developed a thin ice crust that required attention. She was working her way along it carefully when the crust gave way under her left boot, and she went down sideways against the slope. She caught herself on her right hand and one knee, and the fall was minor, the kind of stumble she would not ordinarily have thought about for more than a moment. But the angle of it had pulled her coat and the heavy wool shirt beneath it up along her back, and she was in the process of pushing herself upright when she heard him on the trail behind her. She had not heard him follow her. She had thought herself alone. She got to her feet and turned. Silas was standing 6 feet up the trail, absolutely still, with the expression of a man who has just been shown something he cannot unsee, and is in the process of deciding what to do with it. His eyes moved from her face quickly, with the deliberateness of someone redirecting their own attention by force of will, but she knew what he had seen. The shirt had ridden up. The scars on her back were not subtle. They were old and they were numerous, and they were the kind that told an unambiguous story to anyone who had lived long enough to know what that kind of damage required. She straightened her coat. "I slipped," she said, "the ice crust on the left side of the trail." "I heard," he said. She turned and continued to the spring. She filled the bucket. She could hear him on the trail behind her, giving her the space of several yards, and she was grateful for it without being able to articulate exactly why. Only that she had spent a great deal of her life being looked at as a problem to be managed, and she did not want to feel that way right now. He did not say anything about it that morning, or that afternoon. That night by the fire, when she made the joke, she would not be able to say exactly why she made it. Some habits were older than dignity. She had learned long ago to name herself before someone else could, to reduce herself to something manageable and even laughable before a crueler voice could do it first. It had been a form of self-protection for so long that it had stopped feeling like a choice. She had been banking the fire for the night, moving the coals with the long-handled iron, and she had caught a glimpse of her own shadow thrown large against the cabin wall by the firelight, enormous and broad and shapeless in its heavy layers, and she said almost without meaning to say it out loud, "Hard to believe anything could be frightened of a creature that looks like a bear in a coat." She meant it as the small, self-deflating thing she had always meant such comments to be. A release valve, a way of saying it first. Silas put down the piece of leather he was working and looked at her. Not the quick glance of a man who has heard something and is moving past it, but the full, steady attention that she had come to recognize as his particular mode of taking the measure of things. "Stop," he said. She turned from the fire and met his gaze, surprised by the directness of it, the single word carrying a weight she had not expected. He said it again quieter. "Stop." She waited. He leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her the way he looked at the mountain, with the complete attention of a man who is reading something he considers worth reading. "I saw your back this morning," he said. "I did not intend to, but I did." She said nothing. Her hands were still on the fire iron. "Those marks," he said, "were made by someone who intended to break you. The fact that you are sitting in this cabin 4 hours from that valley, having walked through a whiteout, carrying everything you needed to survive on your own back, means they failed." He paused, and the pause had weight. "This body of yours did not fail. It carried you through every single thing that was done to it, and through everything you put it through on top of that. Don't insult the thing that saved your life." The fire iron was very heavy in her hands suddenly. She had been told she was strong, before in the abstract, the patronizing way people tell a woman she is strong when they mean that she has survived something they would prefer not to think about too closely. This was not that. He was not complimenting her resilience as a way of dismissing her pain. He was making a specific and unambiguous argument that the body she had spent 32 years learning to be ashamed of was not something to be ashamed of, and he was making it in the same tone he used to make observations about snowpack and trail conditions, as though it were simply a fact that had been incorrectly filed and required correction. She set the fire iron down carefully. "You sound very certain," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I am," he said. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked back down at his leather work, giving her the privacy of his inattention in the same way he had given her the space on the trail that morning. Deliberate, without making a ceremony of it. She sat down on her side of the hearth and looked at the fire for a long time without seeing it. Something had shifted. She could feel it the way she felt changes in air pressure as a fact before it was fully a thought. Not broken, not rearranged, but shifted the way a bone that has been set wrong and carried wrong for years shifts when someone finally puts their hands on it correctly. It hurt a little. The good things often did. 3 days later, the second set of hunters came through the lower trail. Silas saw the smoke signal first, the way the birds moved from the tree line in the early afternoon, with the particular urgency of animals disturbed by something larger than a deer. He was at the window within moments, and he stood there very still for 60 seconds, watching the tree line, and then he said quietly and without alarm, "We have company below." She was already at her feet. "How many?" "Can't see them yet. The birds came off the east approach." He turned from the window and began moving with the efficient, unhurried speed of a man who has rehearsed for this. "They won't make it to the cabin today. The trail from the east approach is slow even in good conditions, and the snow will cut their pace considerably." He lifted the rifle from its place against the wall and checked it. "But they will make it by tomorrow morning if they are motivated." "Voss's people," she said. It was not a question. Most likely. He set the rifle on the table and looked at her directly. "If I am wrong, we can correct it. If I am right, we need to be thinking about the high ground." She felt the tightening in her chest that she recognized as the specific fear of being cornered, not general fear, but the precise and tactical kind, the kind that sharpened rather than paralyzed. She had felt it once before the night Voss had ridden up the wagon road with her brother, and she had found that the fear handled correctly was more useful than calm. "How many routes to the high ground?" she asked. 3. 2 of them are visible from the east approach if you know what to look for. 1 isn't. The one that isn't. It's difficult, he said. Steep on the first pitch and exposed on the second. In these temperatures, it requires care. "Show me," she said. He looked at her for a brief moment, and in that moment she could see him making the same kind of assessment she had made on the ridge 8 days ago, weighing variables, calculating probabilities, deciding how much confidence to extend. Then he nodded. "After dark," he said, "in case they have a scout higher than I'm giving them credit for." They spent the remaining hours of daylight in careful, methodical preparation. She smoked the remaining meat and wrapped it for carrying. She repacked her kit for the high country different than her original packing, adding the length of strong rope coiled by the door, which she had identified on her second day as something Silas used in the steeper terrain. He assembled what he needed with the same economy, taking only what had a clear purpose, leaving behind everything that did not. At one point she looked up from her packing and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the terrain-reading attention, something quieter than that, something that had a quality of recognition in it. The expression of a man who has lived alone long enough to have forgotten what it was like to have someone next to him who knew what they were doing. She looked back down at her pack. When the darkness was full enough, they went out the cabin's back wall, through a gap she had not known existed, a section of the chinking that gave way when he pressed it in a specific sequence, a door that was not a door. She committed the location to memory without being asked. The road he took through the dark was steep and technical, and would have been genuinely dangerous for someone who did not know how to move on steep snow. She knew how to move on steep snow. She stayed a step behind him where the terrain dictated a step ahead, where her own reading of the slope suggested a better line, and twice she felt him adjust his approach based on her choice without comment. They reached the cave system 2 hours later, cold and breathing hard and safe for now from everything below. Inside, with the wind sealed out by the rock and a small fire built deep enough in the cave to hide its light. Silas laid out what he knew about the terrain above the hunter's likely approach. He drew it in the dirt with the tip of his knife, the ridgelines and the draws, and the place where the snowpack accumulated in a particular way along the eastern cornice. She watched his hands on the drawing with the focused attention she had once given to almanac pages, learning something she did not yet know she would need. "You know this mountain," she said. "Every part of it," he said. "Then we are not without options," she said. He looked at the map in the dirt and then at her, and the firelight caught the pale gray of his eyes and the long seam of the scar and the particular set of his mouth that she had begun to read as his version of acknowledgement. "No," he agreed. "We are not." She pulled her coat around herself and leaned back against the rock and listened to the fire and the mountain outside. And underneath the cold and the fear and the practical urgency of what was coming, something was growing that she did not yet have a name for, but that felt against all reasonable expectation like the specific and startling warmth of not being alone. She slept in 2-hour intervals, the way she had learned to sleep during the difficult seasons on the farm when something always needed checking before dawn. Each time she surfaced from the shallow water of it, she listened first before she moved the cave around her, the mountain beyond it, the particular quality of silence that told her whether anything outside had changed. On her third waking just past what she judged to be midnight, she heard Silas moving. He was at the mouth of the cave, crouched low, looking out at the slope below, through a gap in the rock that gave a sight line down the eastern approach without exposing the watcher to it. She rose quietly and came to stand beside him. He did not startle. He had heard her wake. Below, in the blue dark of the moonlit snow, there were lights. 2 of them moving slowly along the lower trail with the patience of men who intended to arrive rather than men who were hurrying. Torches or lanterns far enough down that they were small but present and deliberate. "They traveled through the night," she said, her voice just above a breath. "They are motivated," he said, and she heard in those 3 words a compression of everything they both understood about what Calder Voss wanted and how much he was willing to spend to get it. She watched the lights for a moment, tracking their pace, reading the intervals between their movements. "They are not scouts," she said. "They are moving like men who already know where they are going." Silas looked at her. "The pace is too consistent," she said. "Scouts move in bursts. They stop and read the terrain. These men are following a bearing, which means they have information." She paused. Someone in the lower country talked. "The trading man 3 ridges west," Silas said. not as a question, but with the flat voice of a man absorbing a fact he wished were different. "Or someone who saw your smoke," she said. "It doesn't change what we need to do." He was quiet for a moment. The lights below continued their patient progress. "They will reach the cabin by first light," he said. "When they find it empty, they will look for a trail. I was careful coming out, but I wasn't as careful as I would have been if I had known they were already moving. How long do we have before they find the trail?" "Depends on whether they have a man who can read snow," he said. "An hour, maybe less." She pulled back from the cave entrance and went to where her pack was laid out. She began checking it with her hands in the dark, by feel confirming each item by touch, a habit so old it was almost involuntary. "Then we use the time we have," she said. He came away from the entrance and crouched beside his own pack. In the low glow of the banked fire, his face was composed entirely, focused the face of a man who had been in difficult positions before and had decided at some point in his past that difficulty was simply another condition to be navigated. She had seen that quality in him over the days in the cabin, the absence of panic as a structural feature rather than a performance of calm. It was one of the things she had come to rely on without quite realizing she had begun to do so. They did not speak while they prepared. They did not need to. The second blizzard arrived with no warning at all. That was unusual. She had been watching the sky at every opportunity and had seen nothing in it that suggested an imminent system, which meant it had developed fast and low and come over the northern ridge in a way the terrain had hidden until it was already on them. The first gust hit the cave mouth like a door being slammed, and within minutes the wind had risen from nothing to a sustained howl that changed the acoustic character of the cave, entirely filling it with sound that bounced off the rock walls from every direction. She and Silas looked at each other across the small fire. "This is the larger storm," she said, "the one that's been building behind the first. I misjudged the timing." "By how much?" "By about 6 hours," she said. There was no apology in it, only the precise acknowledgement of an error, the way a navigator acknowledges a drift in bearing as information to be corrected for. "It changes the situation below as much as it changes ours." "They'll take cover," he said, already moving to the cave entrance to look out. The lights below were gone, swallowed by the white that was now driving horizontally across the slope. "Their camp is in the flat below the tree line, which means they are sheltered enough to wait it out." "But they are pinned," she said, coming up beside him. "The eastern approach is impassable in this. The draw they came up through will be drifting. They cannot move up, and they will not want to move down in this." "And we cannot move either," he said. "No," she agreed. "But we are higher, and we have the cave, and we have the view." He looked at her sidelong, and she saw in the gray of his eyes a quality she had not quite seen there before. Something beyond respect. Something that was asking a question it had not yet decided to put into words. "You are thinking about the cornice," he said. "I have been thinking about it since you drew the map," she said. "The eastern cornice." She had been turning it in her mind for hours, the way you turn a river stone, examining its surfaces. The snowpack along that ridge had been accumulating in the specific way that produced instability. She had identified it when they climbed in the dark from the way the snow surfaced. Changed texture at the upper pitch, a subtle crust over loose depth that had the quality of weight carried too far. It would not take much to change its relationship with the slope below it, but to do it with precision to bring it down in the specific place and in the specific way that would be useful rather than simply catastrophic required two things: an accurate read of the snowpack depth and structure and a single point of applied force in exactly the right location. The first she could provide. The second was his. "It would take out their camp," she said. "Or take out the trail they came up," he said. "Or both," she said, "if the shot is placed correctly." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the mountain with a force that was not theatrical, but simply enormous, the weight of a weather system that did not know or care what was in its path. "I need you to tell me exactly where," he said. They went to the back of the cave where the fire gave enough light to work, and she drew the cornice from memory in the dirt from the angle she had seen it on the climb up, marking the place where the surface crust showed the deepest load, the point where the physics of the slope were already leaning toward a decision and needed only the smallest argument to make it. He studied it with the same focused attention he gave everything worth his focus, asking 2 precise questions about depth and aspect, which she answered, and then he nodded once. "It can be done," he said. "From here," she said, "or do you need a higher position?" "From the second passage," he said, referring to a narrower gap in the cave system 20 feet further in that opened onto a ledge shielded from the wind by an overhang. "It will give me the angle." She looked at the entrance to the passage, then back at him. "Go," she said. "I'll watch the approach." He took the rifle and went. She returned to the cave mouth and settled into the watching position he had used, low and still, her coat pulled tight, her eyes on the white chaos below. She could see nothing clearly. The storm had reduced visibility to a matter of yards, but she was not looking for shapes. She was listening for them. Movement in a blizzard has sound, even when it has no form, the disturbance of the air, the change in the wind's voice when something solid moves through it. She had learned this from a winter she did not like to remember, a younger winter, a worse one, and she had never forgotten the lesson. 5 minutes passed, 10. Then from below, carried on a brief lull in the wind, she heard a voice. Not words, just the shape of a human voice which was enough. They were moving. Despite the storm, or because of what the storm covered, they were moving up the slope. She went back into the cave and down the passage at a controlled run, and found Silas in position on the ledge, the rifle settled on a natural rest of rock, his breathing already in the slow, disciplined rhythm of a man preparing for a shot that required patience. She crouched beside him and spoke directly into the close space between them. "They are moving. Eastern approach coming up. They have at least one man who knows the mountain, or they would not try it in this." He did not move from his position. "How long?" 20 minutes to the base of the cornice pitch, less if they are moving fast. "They will be moving fast," he said. "They will want to reach the high ground before the storm closes completely." A pause, the length of 2 measured breaths. "Show me the exact point again." She leaned across him and indicated the place on the rock wall where she had scratched a mark, the translation of her dirt map into 3 dimensions. His eyes moved from the mark to the slope beyond the ledge opening, calculating the angles with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, the geometry of force and distance and consequence. "Wind is variable," he said. "I will need to account for it. It is running from the northwest in the gusts and dropping to almost nothing in the lulls," she said. "The lulls are running about 40 seconds apart." He looked at her. "I have been counting them," she said simply. Something moved in his face, then past the focus and the composure, something that was not strategy and not calculation, that had its own quality entirely. He looked at her for the space of 2 seconds, which was more than he usually permitted himself, and then he looked back down the slope. "Tell me when the next lull starts," he said. She watched the snow movement along the ledge edge, reading it the way she read the grain in wood, or the set of a trap spring, or anything else that required the full engagement of learned attention. The gust peaked and then subsided, and she felt the air pressure change against her face. "Now," she said. The rifle fired. The sound of it in the enclosed space was tremendous, and then it was gone, swallowed by the returning wind. And for 3 full seconds nothing happened, and she thought the angle had been wrong, or the snowpack had been less loaded than she had read it. And then the cornice moved. It did not explode or collapse dramatically. It released, which was the correct word. The way a held breath releases the upper crust separating from the slope beneath it, with a sound that began as a deep crack and then became something larger than sound, a vibration that came up through the rock they were standing on and through the soles of their boots and into their bones. The snow moved down the eastern pitch in a broad wave, not a wall of white destruction, but a deep and comprehensive rolling that gathered everything in its path, the loose drifts and the packed crust and the accumulated weight of 3 weeks of mountain weather, and sent it down into the draw below with a force that was absolute and impersonal and final. The silence afterward was extraordinary. Silas lowered the rifle. They both listened. From below, after a long moment, they heard voices, several of them shouting with the disorganized urgency of men who have just watched their supplies and their camp and their safe route down the mountain disappear under 6 feet of consolidated snow. Not injured, she judged from the voices the avalanche had taken the eastern draw, but not the men directly, which was what her reading of the snowpack had predicted. Their equipment, their horses, their organization, their certainty gone, but their lives intact, which mattered to her more than she might have expected it to. She said this to Silas without quite planning to say it. "They are alive." "Yes," he said. He was looking at her rather than at the slope. "I did not want them dead," she said. "I wanted them unable to continue." "I know," he said. "That is why I took the angle you indicated." She looked at him. "You adjusted your shot based on my read." "Your read of the snowpack was more accurate than mine would have been," he said. "It would have been foolish not to use it." The wind outside was building again, the second act of the storm, pressing back in. They moved further into the cave, away from the ledge, and she rebuilt the fire with the wood they had carried up, and they sat on either side of it, with the warmth between them and the mountain outside, and the sounds of the retreating men below growing fainter with each passing minute. After a long silence, Silas said, "There is something I have to tell you." She looked across the fire at him. His voice had changed, not much, but she had spent enough days now listening to the specific frequencies of it that the change registered immediately. The composure was still there, but something beneath it had shifted, had risen closer to the surface the way deep water moves when something disturbs it from below. "The man I killed in Harrow County," he said. He was looking at the fire, not at her. His name was Broderick Crane. He was a landowner and a magistrate and a man of considerable standing in 3 counties. She waited. "He had a servant," Silas said, "a woman who had been in his employ for 11 years. He had made her 11 years of living into something that I will not describe in detail because the detail is not necessary for you to understand what it was." The firelight moved across the scar on his face. She had no family, no recourse. The law in that county was Crane's law, because Crane had written it or paid to have it written, which amounted to the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. When he continued, his voice was the same in pitch and tone, but had in it the particular weight of something that has been carried for a long time in a space too small for it. "I had worked his property for 2 seasons as a hired hand. I knew what was happening. I told myself it was not my matter to resolve, that there were people with more standing and more authority who were better positioned to address it. I waited." He paused. "I waited too long. When I finally stopped waiting, Crane was dead, and the woman was alive, and I was the only one on the property without a name that would be believed in a court." The fire crackled. A gust of wind found the cave mouth and pushed into it briefly, stirring the flame, and then withdrew. "So you ran," she said. "I walked," he said. "Running implies fear. I was not afraid of what I had done. I was unwilling to be hanged for it by a system that would not have convicted Crane for what he did." He finally looked up from the fire and met her eyes across it. "I have not spoken of this to any living person since I came to this mountain." She understood the weight of that. Not the information itself, which she had partly assembled already from the pieces he had given her, but the act of saying it, the specific surrender of a wall that had been load-bearing for years. She understood it because she had her own versions of such walls had lived behind them so long, she had sometimes confused them with herself. The woman, she said, what became of her? Something changed in his face, the first real softness she had seen there. Not weakness, but the specific softness of a memory that is painful for the right reasons. She had a sister in the next county. I had sent word before the end through a boy I trusted. She got out. Abigail looked at him across the fire for a long moment at the scarred face and the gray eyes and the composed mouth and the hands that were resting quiet now on his knees, and she thought of everything those hands had built and maintained and protected in the years on this mountain. The tight chinking, the hidden door, the path no stranger could follow, the shot fired not to destroy, but to displace, calculated to within inches of mercy. "You are not what they said you were," she told him. "No," he agreed, "and neither are you." The fire between them burned steadily, and outside the blizzard pressed against the mountain with everything it had, and neither of them moved to close the distance that remained between them, because the distance had already changed into something else entirely, into the particular closeness of two people who have finally told each other the truth and found that the truth, against all expectation, held. They stayed in the cave through the rest of that night and into the following morning, not because they were afraid to move, but because the mountain made the decision for them. The second blizzard did not release its hold until well past dawn, and even then the wind ran in unpredictable gusts that would have made the descent genuinely dangerous, the kind of dangerous that had no strategic value and served no purpose. Silas had said early in their time together that the mountain could be used, or it could be endured, but it could not be argued with. She had come to understand exactly what he meant. So they waited, and the waiting had its own quality now, different from the waiting of the first storm in the cabin. That had been the waiting of two strangers in the same space, each maintaining careful distance, each performing a kind of watchful neutrality. This was something else. They sat on the same side of the fire because the heat distributed better that way, their shoulders not quite touching, and they talked in the low, unhurried way of people who have run out of reasons to guard their words. He told her about the first winter on the mountain, how he had nearly not survived it, not from cold or from lack of skill, but from a particular kind of despair that had no specific source and was therefore very difficult to fight. You could fight a wolf or a storm or a man with a rifle. You could not easily fight the feeling that your life had narrowed to a point too small to continue inhabiting. He said it plainly, without drama or self-pity, the way he said everything as a fact that had been true and then had been survived. She told him about her mother's last weeks, the things she had not permitted herself to sit with since the night she walked out of that farmhouse. Not the practical details, not the nursing and the medications and the slow, terrible arithmetic of it, but the smaller things that no one ever talked about in the accounting of loss. The way her mother had still, even near the end, noticed things worth noticing, a particular quality of afternoon light, the sound of the creek running under the ice in February. The way she had looked at Abigail in the last clear days with an expression that contained unmistakably both grief and pride, and had said nothing because nothing was adequate, and she had always preferred silence to inadequacy. Silas listened the way he did everything with his complete attention, not filling the silences with reassurance or redirection, just listening. It was, she thought, one of the rarest things a person could offer another person, and most people never managed it. The wind dropped to almost nothing in the early afternoon. They descended in stages, reading the snow conditions at each pitch before committing to the next moving with the careful efficiency of two people who had now spent enough time on this mountain together that their pacing had synchronized without either of them engineering it. She went first on 2 sections where the reading of the slope was more important than the physical navigation. He went first on 2 others where the reverse was true. Neither of them commented on the arrangement. When the cabin came into view below the tree line, they stopped. The door was open, not blown open, not ajar from settling. Opened fully, standing wide in the cold air with the deliberateness of a door that has been opened by a hand. Someone had been inside. Silas put out his arm, not touching her, but indicating stop, and she was already stopped. They stood in the tree line for 5 full minutes, reading the area around the cabin the way you read any piece of ground you are about to commit, to looking for movement, for the shape of a man in the shadows, for anything that broke the pattern of snow and stillness and cold afternoon light. Nothing moved. "One set of tracks," she said quietly, reading the snow in front of the cabin door. "Came from the east trail. 1 man, medium weight, moving fast. He went in and came back out." "A scout," Silas said, "sent ahead of the others to confirm the cabin before they committed to the climb." "He is already back down reporting," she said, "which means the others are reassembling on the lower trail." She calculated the timing. "We have an hour, perhaps a little more." They looked at each other. In his face she could see the same thing she felt, not fear, but the specific weight of a decision point, the place in a road where it forks and the choice made cannot be unmade. They could go back up. The cave was defensible and provisioned, and the hunters had just lost their camp and their morale to the avalanche. A retreat to the high ground was not irrational, but she was tired of retreating. The thought arrived with a clarity that surprised her in its simplicity. She had been retreating her entire life, from the shape the world insisted she should have, from the expectations she would never satisfy, from her brother's weakness and Voss's greed and the town's quiet contempt. She had retreated so many times that she had started to think retreat was simply the condition of her existence, the only reasonable response to a world that did not want her in it on her own terms. She thought of Silas's voice by the fire 3 nights ago. "Never insult the very thing that saved your life." "I am not going back up the mountain," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Then we end it here." "Yes," she said, "we end it here." They went into the cabin, and they worked fast. Silas took the rifle to the high window on the north wall that gave a clear sight line down the eastern approach for nearly 400 yards, a position he had clearly considered before, because he went to it without hesitation, and the angle of the shutter suggested it had been used for this purpose in the past. She took the layout of the cabin itself and thought about it with the practical directness she brought to any problem of space and positioning. The cabin had 2 doors, the front and the hidden back exit. It had 3 windows. The walls were solid. If the hunters came with numbers, the structure itself was an asset. It narrowed their advantage and removed their ability to surround effectively. If the hunters came with sense, they would try to talk first. She was counting on a measure of sense, not because she trusted Voss's men to be reasonable men, but because reasonable men survived longer in the high country, than unreasonable ones, and Voss would have selected for survivability. She was right. They came in the mid-afternoon, 4 of them, and they came up the front approach without concealment, which was itself a form of communication. You approached a man's cabin openly when you wanted to negotiate. You came in the tree line when you intended violence. 4 men in the open suggested that Voss wanted his property returned intact, which meant alive, which meant there was a conversation to be had before anything worse. She watched them come through the north window from Silas's position. He was beside her, the rifle resting on the sill, his eye not at the sight, but on the men below, reading them. "The one on the left has been here before," she said. "He knows which way the door opens." "The one at the back right is the shooter," Silas said. "He is holding his position at range. He does not intend to come to the door." She had seen it too. The formation had a logic to it: 2 men forward to talk 1 man to the side for physical reinforcement, if needed 1 man back with a rifle of his own for the case where everything else failed. It was a professional arrangement. These were not local men hired for a day's work. "Voss spent real money," she said. "Voss wants to make an example," Silas said. "If you get away, others get ideas." She absorbed that. Then she made her decision. "I am going to the door," she said. He looked at her sharply. "They want me," she said, "not you. If I go to the door, they will talk to me, and while they are talking to me, you have the angle on the shooter in the back. Remove him from the arrangement, and their formation loses its foundation. If they decide not to talk," he said. "Then you will not wait for them to finish deciding," she said, "but they will talk." 4 men came up a difficult mountain in the aftermath of a blizzard to collect 1 woman. They will have things they want to say before they do anything else. Men like this always do. He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see the conflict in it, the calculation running against something that was not calculation, something that had grown over the weeks in ways neither of them had planned for. "I will be at the window," he said finally. "I know," she said. She put on her coat, checked that her mother's knife was at her belt, and went to the front door. She opened it and stepped outside into the cold afternoon light and stood on the cabin's small stoop with her hands at her sides, visible and empty, and looked at the 4 men coming up the approach. The 2 forward men stopped at 15 feet. The one on the left, the one who knew the door, was broad-faced and professionally expressionless. He looked at her with the evaluating attention of a man confirming a description he had been given. "Abigail Fenwick," he said. "That is my name," she said. "Mr. Voss has asked us to extend an invitation to return to the valley with us," he said, in the tone of a man who understood the word invitation was doing considerable work in that sentence. "Mr. Voss can extend his invitations to someone who requested them," she said. "I did not." The man's expression did not change. "The debt is legitimate, Miss Fenwick. The papers are in order." "The papers," she said, "represent an agreement made by my brother about a person he had no right to make agreements about. I am not property. I was not property when those papers were signed, and I am not property now." She kept her voice level. She was not performing bravery. She was stating facts in the tone they deserved. "If Mr. Voss wishes to pursue his debt, he may pursue it with the man who created it." "Your brother has left the county," the man said. A new piece of information delivered with the calm of someone who knows the information changes the landscape. He is not available to pursue anything. She had known somewhere that Harlan would run. He had always run from the results of his own choices. The knowledge of it did not grieve her the way it might once have. It clarified things. "Then the debt," she said, "dies with his departure. I have no obligation to substitute myself for a man who chose to absent himself from his own debts." "The law," the man said, beginning again. "The law is 4 days' ride from this mountain," she said, "and I am standing on it right now." From behind the man on the left, the 3rd man shifted his position, moving slightly toward the cabin's side wall, a repositioning that was not aggressive but was preparatory. She saw it. More importantly, she felt the moment in the north window above her, the change in Silas's presence that meant he had seen it too, and had made his own adjustment. She held the forward man's gaze and did not look up. "I will not go with you," she said. "That is the complete answer. You can take it back to Voss and tell him it was delivered clearly and without ambiguity." She paused. "And you should know that the man in this cabin has held a bead on your man in the back right for the last 3 minutes and has not yet exercised it. That restraint is a courtesy. I would not test its duration." The forward man was still for a long moment. His eyes moved briefly to the north window, then back to her face. She watched him do the arithmetic. 4 men on a difficult mountain in winter conditions. One of them already neutralized by position, their camp and supplies buried 2 draws to the east. The woman in front of them showing no fear whatsoever, and a rifle in the window that had a clear account with gravity on its side. The arithmetic did not favor continuing. He looked at her one more time, the long, assessing look of a professional man closing a calculation. Then he said something quiet to the man beside him and turned and walked back down the approach. The other 3 followed. The man in the back right turned last, and she watched him go with the patient attention she gave to all things until she was certain they were committed to the descent and not to a change of mind. When they cleared the tree line, she went back inside and closed the door. Silas was at the table. The rifle was leaning against the wall. He was looking at her with an expression that she had not seen on him before. Not exactly, though it contained elements she recognized, the quality of a man who has watched something remarkable and is still in the process of understanding that he witnessed it. "You were not afraid," he said. "I was," she said. "I have learned that fear and action are not mutually exclusive." He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, something happened to his face that she had not seen there at all in the weeks she had known him. Not a smile exactly, the musculature of it was too restrained for that, but the specific warming of an expression that had been kept very cold for a very long time, like stone in the first real light of spring. It lasted only a moment, but it was real, and she saw it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "They will report back to Voss," he said, returning to practicality. "They will report back," she agreed, sitting down across the table from him, "that the approach is lost, the camp is destroyed, and the woman is not retrievable at any cost that makes the recovery worthwhile." She thought for a moment. "There is also a reasonable chance they will report that the avalanche took us. They did not see us directly, and dead is an easier story to bring back than failed." He considered this. "You are suggesting they may close the account themselves." "Men who work for Voss do not like to admit failure," she said, "and an avalanche is a respectable way to lose a trail. No one questions the mountain." The fire in the hearth had burned low while they were in position. She rose and built it back up, adding wood with the economy of long practice, and when she turned back, he was watching her with that quality of attention again, the one that had started as terrain reading and had become something with a name she had not yet said aloud. She said it now, not in those words, but in the way she sat back down across from him and looked at him directly, without the careful calibration she had once needed. "I am not leaving this mountain," she said. The words settled into the room. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the light was changing the short winter afternoon, already beginning its descent toward the deep blue of early dark, the sky through the window, the particular clear shade that follows the end of a storm, washed clean of everything that had been pressing against it. "This mountain is not comfortable," he said. "It does not get easier with time." "I know that," she said. "I am not," he said, and paused, choosing the words with the same precision he brought to a shot, a man who is easy to be near. "I have noticed that," she said. "I am still here." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said simply and without decoration, "Then stay." Spring came to Black Ridge Pass the way spring always comes to high country. Reluctantly and in stages, the snow retreating first from the south-facing slopes, the rock faces warming a degree at a time, the creek below the cabin finding its voice again under the thinning ice. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was the slow insistence of a season that knew it was coming and did not need to announce itself. She was at the creek on a morning in what she judged to be late March when she heard him on the path behind her. She knew his step by now the way she knew her own breathing. She did not turn. The snowmelt was running clear and cold over the stones. The sound of it, the particular sound of water that has been locked up for months and is now moving again, urgent and purposeful. She had been crouching at the bank, washing her hands, feeling the current pull at her fingers when she heard him stop on the path behind her and stay stopped for long enough that she knew it was not a pause in transit. She turned. He was standing in the path with the particular quality of stillness that meant he had come with intention. In his hand was something she could not immediately identify, small, pale, smooth. He held it out. She stood and took it. It was a ring. Carved from bone, she could see immediately from a stag antler by the grain, and color of it worked smooth and finished with oil until it had the quality of something polished by years of handling rather than hours of work. But she could see at the inner surface the tool marks of a man who had done this carefully and by firelight over a long period of time. The ring was not perfect. It was precise. She looked up at him. He was not kneeling because he was not a man given to performance, and she did not need him to be. He was standing in the path in the clear spring light, with his scarred face and his gray eyes and his complete and unperformed attention, and he said what he had to say in the way he said everything directly and without softening. "The world out there has no use for either of us on our own terms," he said. "I stopped wanting it to some time ago. This mountain has enough for a life if the life is built right." He paused. "I would like to build it with you." She turned the ring in her fingers. She could feel the care in it, the weeks of quiet work, the intention behind every hour of it. She thought of the farmhouse and the cold kitchen and the water she had hauled and the things she had endured and the night she had walked out into the dark with nothing but her mother's knife and her mother's lessons and the absolute refusal to be what someone else had decided she would be. She thought of Silas at the cave mouth counting her breath intervals without being asked. Silas adjusting his shot to her red. Silas's voice by the fire, fierce and certain and without a single unnecessary word. Never insult the very thing that saved your life. She put the ring on her finger. It fit. "Yes," she said. He looked at her hand and then at her face, and the thing that had happened to his expression in the cabin, that brief and restrained warming, returned now without the restraint, fully and quietly and without apology. They stood by the running creek in the spring light for a moment that required nothing added to it. Then she said, "The south slope is clear enough to turn. If we start the garden bed this week, we will have the ground ready before the last frost." "I have been thinking the same," he said. They walked back up the path together toward the cabin, toward the ridge above it, where the view on clear days reached further than seemed possible, all the way to the distant valley and the world that had decided long ago and incorrectly what both of them were worth. The garden would be good this year. The soil at this elevation was thin but honest, the kind that did not promise what it could not deliver, that required real work and returned real yield. She intended to learn every inch of it. She had time now. She had all the time the mountain would give her, and she intended to use it well. That had always been, in the end, the only thing she had ever really asked for. Not to be saved, not to be carried, not to be decided for. Only time and ground to stand on, and the freedom to be exactly what she was. The creek ran on behind them, cold and clear and newly free, finding its way down the mountain with the unhurried confidence of a water that has been waiting all winter and knows exactly where it is going.